Okay. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for coming to my presentation. My name is Kasia Hartwig. I'm a director of research and consulting at Valona Intelligence. Valona Intelligence is a full service market intelligence company that helps other companies monitor and understand their business environments. Our mission is to make sure that all the decisions you make, you and your management make, are truly insight driven. Today, I will talk to you about reading market shifts before they disrupt your business, and maybe generally looking from the geopolitical standpoint, but also can carry to other dimensions like competitive market, etc. And maybe looking at the market and disruption not only as a risk mitigation issue, but an opportunity for your companies as well. Okay, so I'm going to start by, all right, I'm going to start by talking about the zero distance effect. Who here has heard about this term, zero distance effect? Nobody? Good, because I invented it together with my new best friend, Claude. What does it mean? It means that companies for a very, very long time felt that geographic distance was a protective barrier of sorts. And things that were happening somewhere, in China or Malaysia or Venezuela would not necessarily immediately or maybe ever make it into their bottom line or business conversation. I think that this assumption that geographic distance is protecting us can be effectively dismantled, has effectively collapsed. We live in such a profoundly globalized world today with such complex and enmeshed supply chains, and most companies' ambition to operate and grow in a really large and varied number of international markets, that we do not have this luxury anymore to say something is not my problem. It is pretty sure that if something geopolitically significant will happen somewhere in the world, it's going to be your problem. It is going to show up in your supply chain, in your customer base, in your compliance issues, workforce, and eventually, of course, in your P&L. So hence zero distance effect. There is no distance between the event itself and the business impact. What you see here are the global shipping choke points, because of course, at the moment, everyone is discussing the Strait of Hormuz and the effect it has on the global economy. There are several choke points like this, but this entire idea is not only about this. It is about other things like elections and natural disasters and national infrastructure. We are so connected today that we really have to pay attention to those topics. So we live effectively in a shrinking world, in a smaller world. But the second thing that happened in the last years is that we're living in an accelerating world, a much faster one. Yeah. Since 2008, like between 2008 and 2020, we pretty much had a period of relative stability and relaxation, let's say, when it comes to business. And then 2020 happens, COVID pandemic. And this is the first event that really, truly exposes the supply chain issue, right? And the fragility of those supply chains and how interconnected we all are. And relatively quickly after that, Russia invades Ukraine, and then you have the effects of this. You have the European energy shock, you have the impact on fertilizers and different raw materials, chemicals. And this conflict, as we know, is ongoing, continuing till today. And then again, shortly after, you have Red Sea disruptions in 2023. Yemeni Houthi rebels are attacking ships and forcing companies to change their shipping routes. And they're disrupting maybe the just-in-time shipments and cold chains and increasing freight costs. This also is continuing to this day. And then 2025, we have Donald Trump in the White House, and we have the US tariffs, which generally create panic and chaos everywhere. And now 2026, again, Donald Trump and the US intervention in Iran, we have Strait of Hormuz closure, which again is impacting the feedstocks, fertilizers, raw materials, and energy costs. So effectively, I don't think we can look at this and say that this is exceptional. It might feel exceptional, but I don't think it is. I think this is the new normal, and we should expect that every year or two, we will see some sort of disruptive event in the world. For your industry, you have another layer that makes it more complex. This is the regulatory layer, of course, and it creates an additional complexity to this entire situation. So, you have the compliance, you have the approval timelines, you have the registration regimes, topics which effectively limit options for many companies. because they force them into maybe single supplier relationships or make them dependent on specific substances or specific markets. So you have those three layers. You have a shrinking world, you have an accelerating world, you have this additional regulatory complexity. Is it all bad? Like, does it mean that like everyone is in trouble? I don't think so, not necessarily. So we believe that volatility can be a source of competitive advantage. If you are set up properly, if you have a proper intelligence infrastructure and you are able to see in which direction the world is moving and what can happen, and you're prepared for this, you can act much faster than the others who are so scrambling and trying to understand what's going to happen. And you can create certain opportunities and deals for yourself when others can't. So it could be in, better contracts at better prices, or acquiring some distressed assets, or acquiring customers of companies who are not able to fulfill their contracts. So there are definitely some opportunities in times of disruption if you know what to look for and if you are prepared. So I have a question for you. Do you guys feel in your companies, in your functions, that you are currently set up well to succeed in times of disruption? By show of hands, anyone here feels that they're ready? Okay, nobody feels ready. I think this aligns pretty well with the research that we've been doing and companies we've been talking to. So on average, 82% of companies report that they're operating in increasingly uncertain and unpredictable environments. Yeah. But only 25% of companies say that they feel resilient across their key dimensions. And even less, 16 companies feel confident about their foresight capabilities. Foresight meaning being able to see what is likely to happen in the future, in which direction the market is going, or competitors are going, or regulation, or geopolitics. So this is a kind of a status quo for most companies. Okay. And the reason why this is, what I think most companies are missing, or what the main issues are, is that most companies do not really truly have a very operational, effective, efficient intelligence setup. So on one hand, you might have some blind spots, right? This could be your spot. You might be tracking your competitors, but maybe not looking at the most important things or most impactful things to your business. But it could be other blind spots like geopolitical or market or regulatory or even customer, right? Your customer is shifting and you're not realizing. So on one hand, some companies have those blind spots. They're not monitoring and tracking and analyzing this enough. Then most companies have setups where they have quarterly reports, or maybe less. Like quarterly is actually not bad, but maybe less than quarterly. And those reports are prepared and churned and delivered, right? But market doesn't move. There are events that happen all the time, right? And any sort of decision making that you're doing has to be based on intelligence that is in real time and provides you information in real time. The third one is that very often, whatever intelligence you have in your companies, your competitive market, geopolitical intelligence, it's siloed somewhere. So geopolitical intelligence usually sits somewhere in regulatory or legal affairs or somewhere like in risk teams, right? It's pretty much distanced from operational teams, from procurement, from commercial teams, from strategy sometimes. And the same can be true for your competitive market intelligence teams. They might be, reporting to one function, but really distributing the information widely across the organization to everyone who needs it. And the final thing is that intelligence very often is not constructed and formatted in a way that truly supports decision making. Yeah, you get some sort of a report that's 50 pages, it's very dense and complex, but it doesn't really tell you what it means for you and what are some options, what you could do. So it's really disconnected from the decision making. We believe that timing in the market, timing is everything, right? So usually when something happens, it didn't happen out of nowhere. There were signals beforehand. There were early signals that you could have leveraged, captured to know that something is unrolling. Nothing really is a surprise. So the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that actually truly was not a surprise. There were signals, there was intelligence that was pointing to this. Same with Strait of Hormuz. I mean, you already had information about it in the press before it happened, right? So typically there are early signals that you can gather and you can act on. Most companies don't. They don't have a capability to do that. And then what happens? It happens. So big kind of earth moving event happens. And most companies, what they do, they enter this rush context sprint. So they're scrambling, and trying to figure out what happened, what does it mean, what can we do, Nobody really knows. And it's kind of like a moment of panic of trying to figure out what does it mean and what are we going to do. This results effectively in fewer options. So most companies that are they're thinking, after a change happens, they effectively have fewer options. Their decision window becomes small, very small, or they have to do their decision time. So stress for everyone, maybe not the best decision you could have made. What is much better would be setting up your system in a way where you do harvest those early signals, you do create some context building for your company, for your function, etc. You do create some scenarios and options of what the impact is and what can be done about this, and that you do have a very, I would say, maybe not leisurely, but a much longer decision window for your management team and for your different functions, right? This results in a much kind of stronger position and better business impact, especially if you can make those decisions before your competitors do, especially if you have all the information needed and all of the plans needed to make those decisions before your competitors make them. Okay, so what I would advocate and recommend for most companies would be to create this 3-layer intelligence architecture. It is really simple on the outside. 1, monitoring; 2, analysis; 3, action. But I think the importance is in the details and execution and how those different layers are connected to one another. So monitoring is the first step. What you need is sort of a systematic, automated signal harvesting that goes across all the relevant dimensions. It might be the market, regulation, your competitors, geopolitical events that you are kind of exposed to, let's say, or parts of the globe that you're exposed to. The system has to filter noise. So you really, truly should be getting the information that is business relevant to you. You don't need all sorts of information. You need only the information that is needed to make your decisions, and hopefully without missing anything, any of the early signals. And it has to be structured in a way that follows your business critical issues, your interests, your strategy, etc. The second step would be to analyze this information. And from experience, I know that if companies have a monitoring function, usually there is a disconnect between the monitoring and analysis. Connecting these two is super important. You have to be able to relatively quickly analyze the signals that are coming to you. And this, when I say analysis, that you can derive business impact mapping, so connect events or probabilities of events to specific business issues and specific business topics, factors like supply chain, for example, or workforce. It is. You also have to have some sort of a dynamic risk scoring dynamic, so that it's not done once a quarter, but it's done on a somewhat continuous basis. And within that risk scoring, you have to look at the likelihood of different events happening. So if we're talking about geopolitics, Russia-Ukraine war or the intervention in Iran, what is the likelihood that this event is going to happen? What is the impact of this event if it happens? What is the impact on your business? What is the velocity? So how fast do you think this is going to unroll? Is this like a slow burn or a fast moving train? And finally, what is the time horizon? So when is it expected to happen? And the third component of analysis would be playbooks that are preloaded. So this is already going a step further and saying for those most critical and impactful events, if they happen, should they happen, what are the costs to your organization? What are the mitigation options? And what are maybe some opportunities that you can find in those events or those crises, that you can leverage for your company? And you ideally would have this before any sort of crisis happens. And then the third layer is action. So again, as much as there was a disconnect between monitoring and analysis, there's often like a disconnect between analysis and action. So you have many teams who get this, again, as I said, dense analysis, but it doesn't really tell them what to do. It's still kind of, unclear for them. There are different reasons for this. So in order to make intelligence actionable, analysis, what you would have to do is to, first of all, make sure that it's routed to the right desk. So the right people get the right information, right? That's number one. Two, that it comes in a decision-ready format. So that means that it's linked again to different probabilities, it's linked to costs, it already kind of out for mitigation or opportunity options. And then finally, it's all connected to what I call the pre-delegated decision-making authority. So based on those mitigation options, some decisions would have to be made. And already ahead, you can say, these are the types of decisions, right? And this is under which circumstances we would take those decisions or make those decisions, so that you don't have to have a very long window where you're deciding and agreeing and aligning, but you can really act super fast. So this is actually very simple. Here I'm showing you a very simple framework, an idea of a framework you could do. So for example, for the US-Iran conflict, we developed this very quickly, relatively quickly. So you have on one hand the different, timelines. You have short term, we already passed that. You have the medium term, long term. You can change this depending on what those mean to your company. And then you can look at it across different dimensions. So here we specifically looked at feedstock input costs, supply chain availability, demand and markets, etc. I'm not going to go through this, but if you want to come and see us, we can give you a copy of this analysis. So this is a relatively simple thing to deliver, and it's very impactful for your decision makers. And then, of course, you would need to have an architecture that supports all I spoke about. So monitoring, analysis, and decision making. We specialize in this, and we have a very strong point of view on this. We do believe that this monitoring should come from a large and complete set of sources. So on one hand, it would be the qualitative sources, your editorial news from different markets, different languages, etc., but also quantitative sources, so your trade data and competitor financials, etc., and market reports, either the ones that you do internally or you purchase externally. And finally, something that is very important and usually not leveraged and underestimated is the field intelligence. So the entirety of intelligence that rests within your organization, that your employees, your client-facing teams already have, but they don't really have tools to share and widely kind of distribute across the company. So these are typically the inputs. And the outputs, could also be very varied depending on what you're trying to support. So on one hand, you have you can have a daily alerts and newsletters. So when something happens, immediately, and it's really tailored to your business, but also first stage of analysis where you can look at what it means. And trend radars for looking into the future and foresight and trying to track, the direction in which the market, competitors, regulation is going. You can have it connected to whatever tools are being used within your company. Ideally, it has to be delivered to the stakeholders that need to have this information in the most convenient manner. And finally, you can also collaborate and socialize. So get some feedback from your teams back. So this is a pretty complete, I would say, picture when it comes to having an infrastructure like this in place. And then concretely, maybe, if you find this topic as interesting and as crucial and as important to your companies as I think it is, there are some things that you could do this week. So something, if you're interested in this, is mapping maybe your top 3 geopolitical exposures against your supplier footprint. I don't know which functions you guys come from, but like whether you're on the intelligence delivery side or you're the consumers of intelligence, but figuring out how it works in your companies, who provides this type of information, or maybe who receives this type of information in what format, and maybe what format do you need or would suit you, or can you leverage this in your functions? This could be something very interesting. And then finally, also run one scenario exercise against the current conflict in Iran. So how does it affect the business issues that you specifically are dealing with? If you would like to know more, please get in touch. We have this tagline at Valona. It says, nothing beats knowing first. I'm going to change it and say, I think nothing beats deciding first or before your competitors. So I think this is really important.